So let's pick up again. So thank you for coming back in the room after a very breathtaking discussion, I think, in the previous session. So the present session will, in a way, continue it and widen the discussion, also to include issues on data collection, identification of users, and quality of services. It will be monitored by our head of unit, Filomena Kiriko, and by Camille Amalout. So over to you both.
Thanks, Rita, and so welcome to the last session of the day. So it's the second panel, which is devoted to the analysis of the more technical details of how we see the challenges to solve the interoperability, or how to apply the interoperability provision of the DMA. I'm here with 4 panelists. So we have Steven, whom you just heard, who's representing Meta. And with us we have also Luca from PEReN, who's the tech lead for the French government service providing technical expertise for digital matters and then in particular interoperability, AI, algorithmic aspects, AI and so on. We have Rowan Meyer for Wire. He's Vice President for Engineering, Architecture, Systems, Software and Networks. And he's active also in the MIME, which we had heard about before as well. And Markus at the end, who's an engineer at the BNetzA, the Bundesnetzagentur, the German telecoms regulator. So as Rita said, we have here more a focus on say perhaps we can put it the user experience, the end user point of view, the interface, data protection, privacy aspects and so on, which were raised already in the first panel and were present across also the discussion we just had in the second one. So I think we are very much looking forward now to dive into these specific aspects. So here I have that Steven will take the first spot this time.
Thank you, Filomena. Thanks again for the invite to discuss this topic. As Filomena said, in the previous session, we talked about some of the initial thinking about how to build an interoperability solution that prioritizes security and end-to-end encryption, along with the DMA's core principles. And in this session now, in my opening remarks, just want to touch on how we're thinking through some of the other key safeguards, recognizing this DMA text, including user safety, privacy, and choice. And we obviously touched on some of these already, so I just want to build out some of those remarks. Turning first to the challenges we face today when it comes to user safety and how we ensure that on WhatsApp. I think given the scale at which WhatsApp operates, it's inevitable some people will try to use the service to take advantage of it and to try to abuse it. Just by way of reminder, as we've discussed, 2 billion daily active users delivering 100 billion messages and 1 billion calls each day. And in combating the bad actors that can happen on the service, WhatsApp bans more than 8 million accounts globally each month for harmful messaging that violates WhatsApp's terms of service. And that's nearly 100 million accounts annually that are banned, a scale obviously larger than many messaging platforms. And WhatsApp understands the responsibility it has to protect people from potential harm, and it does it in a number of ways. First, WhatsApp prevents abuse through product design, stopping it from happening in the first place through product functionality and features. Crucially, WhatsApp is not designed to grow an audience, so you have to have someone's phone number to contact them, and you cannot search for unconnected people or groups. WhatsApp doesn't make content suggestions or recommendations to connect with other users. Other basic design features include labels on highly forwarded content and strict forward limits for messages. Taken together, these important core product features help users identify when a message has not come from a close personal contact, and they introduce friction in the messaging experience to constrain spam and the sharing of potentially viral content. As a result of these and other measures, some 90% of messages sent on WhatsApp are just one-to-one. Secondly, WhatsApp provides a range of strong user controls, enabling people to keep themselves safe on the service. For example, the very first time you get a message from someone outside of your address book, we ask if you want to block them or report the content. This gives users control to decide who should be able to contact them, as well as the ability to report potentially harmful content to WhatsApp, which Paul and others have raised in the previous session. Thirdly, WhatsApp recognizes that it can't prevent all harmful activity. So we design ways to catch those who, despite our best efforts, try to use WhatsApp to cause harm. And given WhatsApp is protected by end-to-end encryption, as I outlined earlier, we only have access to limited data. However, using that limited data, WhatsApp's machine learning systems work to remove fake and automated accounts by identifying the types of abnormal messaging behavior that can indicate harmful activity, including spam. And again, where appropriate, WhatsApp can ban accounts for violating terms of service. So again, how are we thinking about maximizing user safety and an interoperable experience? As I noted in relation to security and end-to-end encryption in the earlier panel, opening up a network on the scale of WhatsApp to third-party networks for the first time, whether benign or nefarious, inevitably introduces additional risk to users and exacerbates some of the safety challenges we already face today. External studies suggest that as much as half of all emails sent is spam. I think we can agree that we don't want interoperability under the DMA to lead to something similar in messaging. So adopting the same principles focused on users that we currently deploy to keep people safe on WhatsApp today, we think this breaks down into 3 key areas. First, in terms of product design, WhatsApp's proposed approach to discovery largely follows the status quo, where you must know the user's identity, which in WhatsApp's case is the user's phone number, to be able to send them a message. As I said earlier, we think this is a key product safeguard to keep people safe on WhatsApp. This also largely mirrors the approach to email and SMS, where you must know someone's email address or phone number before being able to contact them. And once you send a message for the first time, the recipient should have the control to decide whether to block the other user, or report unwanted or harmful content. In previous studies of interoperability reviewed by the think tank WIC, users expressed concerns about being contactable by third parties on apps they reserve for close friends and family. That's why we agree with WIC's recommendation that users should be given clear and comprehensible control over who is allowed to contact them. And in addition, given the importance of user reporting in identifying harmful users and behavior, we think it's important to maintain the ability for users to securely report others and to report harmful content. Second, turning to user experience and privacy. Another key safeguard in the DMA is that users shall remain free to decide whether to use interoperability. And we agree with WIC, SARE and others that this requirement points to relying on an opt-in mechanism, including granular controls to include or exclude individual services from being able to reach you as a user. As part of the decision whether to opt in or not, we think it's also important that users should be provided with clear information regarding the key differences between a first-party and third-party interoperable messaging experience. This includes ensuring users are aware that they're sharing data with a third-party service, subject to different terms of service, different privacy policies, and different security rules to those that apply to their chats on WhatsApp's network. Users also need to be made aware that they won't have access to the full set of messaging experiences given the DMA's focus on basic functionality, something again we discussed in the earlier panel. We believe this level of transparency and control is important so that users can make conscious and informed choice whether to implement interoperability based on assessment of the risks involved. Again, we think this is a key safeguard in the DMA text. Third and finally, we're thinking through objective criteria to identify what should be considered a reasonable request for interoperability as required under the DMA. We're also thinking about the circumstances in which a third-party service could be potentially removed based on abuse of interoperability, such as systematic and repeated patterns of harmful behavior. Welcome views from the room, obviously, but this could take the form of a security, spam, or harmful content threshold, above which a service could be given a warning, and then if it failed to improve, it could be removed from interoperable service. In conclusion, these are just some of our thoughts from work in progress to build potential solutions to meet some of the challenges raised in Article 7 when it comes to ensuring user safety, privacy, and choice. I think, as I said earlier, opening up a network on the scale of WhatsApp inevitably introduces additional risk to users and exacerbates some of the challenges that WhatsApp currently grapples with on a daily basis. However, again, I hope I've made it clear that WhatsApp is committed to and has already started to address these challenges on how to build that interoperable solution that meets the requirements of the DMA. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Luca, you want to take over from here and tell us your take about the challenges and the possible solutions?
Yes, thanks. Okay. So just one quick slide to present PEReN, because I'm not sure everyone is familiar with this entity. So it's recently created, it's 2 years old, a pool of 20 technical experts within the French government with a scope limited to digital platform regulation. So across all different topics, be it counterterrorism, interoperability, moderation, competition, etc. So it's not a regulator, it's not tech company. It's not a standardization body, but we develop tools for the regulator. We have an academic activity, and we are basically a regulation back office providing analysis and ensuring everyone around us is sharing the same technical analysis of the various objects. So regarding the Article 7 and the interoperability obligations, the question we have is how to efficiently design it so that it is indeed effective, and how to safeguard the principles which are from within this article. So two main ideas that we have, which is that the gatekeeper should not strengthen their position through extra data collection through interoperability, and that the gatekeeper should also be prevented from using dark patterns or deter users from engaging across interoperability. So typically, this is a screenshot from Play Store. When you try to install apps on your smartphone from outside of the Play Store, you have this warning, which is threatening for many users. And so the question is how to implement this with a wording which makes it clear what the user is doing and what are the risks, but still leaves the user in control. So I'll go over typical user journey through interoperability. So first is how do you reconcile identity across different services? So here there are two options that we see. One is based on user or the identity itself, and the second is based on the discussion. So do you want to bridge identities between services to have a real interoperable experience end-to-end? Or do you want, on the contrary, to bridge single discussions and to add extra users to discussion by discussion? It's a different user experience, but it's also very different in terms of data collection and which data are shared. Because when you share on a basis of discussion, you just share token, and it's basically one-time tokens that you share, and you do not share any extra bits of your social network. On the other side, if you share your identity across different platforms, then it means the gatekeeper can link together these profiles and build a larger social graph, not only from the contacts you have on the gatekeeper itself, but also from your third-party identities on other platforms. So basically, it can build shadow profiles, which Facebook was known to do a few years ago. So basically, in this identity reconciliation, there is a risk of, well, there is the option of exchanging only tokens and one-time tokens, or sharing personal identifying information. And there is a trade-off to define between user experience and ease of use and the exposure of PII. Same question with the consent. It can be opt-in, it can be opt-out, it can be, as we saw in the panel 1 this morning, it can be per platform, it can be per user, it can be per discussion or per channel. This is different scopes and different user experience and different rates of opt-in or opt-out, probably. Next, there is a question of discoverability, which is two sides. From user on the small platform, how does he engage conversation with someone on the gatekeeper platform? And the reverse one, how does a user from the gatekeeper platform engage conversation with user on a third-party platform? So for the first side, as a user on the small platform, it can be solved through exposure of APIs, discoverability APIs, of course after consent, because this is personal information which is exposed this way. And same thing, the design of the API might or not minimize the exposure of PII. So you can expose raw phone numbers, raw identifiers, raw nicknames, or you can use hash mechanisms, technologies to hide them and to reconcile identity this way. Same thing on the other side from the gatekeeper platform. So you are a user on the gatekeeper platform and you want to invite or to initiate a conversation with someone on a third-party platform. So there is mainly the question of how do you handle consent to privacy policies, but also to terms of services of the extra platform. And this is really different from one-to-one chat, where you can have basically a mean of inviting someone just like you can now invite by link, by a one-time link. And then when you click the link, you have a consent form and you accept. But for groups, it's much more complicated because there are multiple persons in the groups, so there are multiple platforms as well. And whenever you create a group, it's easy to check which platforms will be added to the groups. But when you add a new user, you add a new platform, and the existing user have to give back their consent. So this is quite a difficult UX to build. It's also there is also the question which was outlined in the end-to-end encryption panel this afternoon about whether you bridge groups together. So one group as a whole on a platform, one group as a whole on another platform, and you build a bridge between them, or whether you add users one by one to the group on the gatekeeper platform. Encryption-wise, in terms of UX, it can change quite a lot what users perceive from the interoperability. Regarding Article 7, there is a question of allowing, enabling interoperability for text messaging. But then what is a text message? So the obvious one is whenever you type some text and you send it, that's a text message. But then when you have emoji reactions, when you have typing indicator, when you have ephemeral messages, is it still text messaging or not? That's a question. And typically this is an exchange between an iPhone and an Android. So on the iPhone you have text and emoji reaction, but on the Android it's text and only text which is sent. So the emoji reaction is actually sent as a text and interpreted as an emoji reaction. So is it a text message or not? And should it be covered by Article 7? Regarding the question of quality of service, so the gatekeeper built a lot of technological stack, and so they are able probably to use the best codecs available, the best technologies available, and to pack as much bits of information as possible in each network packet, so that it's very efficient and it's providing the best quality of service. Then there is a question of how do you preserve this quality of service across interoperability. And same thing, you can have an easy to implement solution where you build on standards and on things which are available on the shelf, but might not be as efficient as a proprietary stack from the gatekeeper. Or on the contrary, you can choose to use and to be as close as possible to the proprietary stack. In this case, there are also questions of royalties and licensing. And this is important for text messaging, but even more for voice or video calls, where codecs are essentials. And so at PEReN, we are building tools to benchmark how the messaging services behave in different and degraded network conditions and in different loads and with different types of messaging, calls, video, voice, etc. And to be able to monitor then whether the quality of service is comparable or not and preserved across interoperability. Regarding security, we talk a lot about end-to-end encryption, but there are also many other security features which should be looked at carefully within the framework of Article 7. In particular, everything like validating user identities, verifying keys, etc. are security features, actually. And same thing with ephemeral messages. It's a best effort security measure, but it's still security measure, and it can be technologically challenging to preserve the same level of security across interoperability. Regarding moderation and abuse, it's a different matter from interoperability. It's not coming from interoperability, but it's something which is more and more important with interoperability. And it's probably a good opportunity to build standardized means of reporting and flagging users on spam. Yeah. So just to mention, we have a website and everything. Whenever we do analysis internally, we try to publish them on our website.
Thanks, Luca. I see you have also replied to one of the questions asked in the previous panels, whether end-to-end encryption security is the same thing, in fact. Passing on, floor to Marcus.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, as we heard already a lot of what, if interoperability is possible or not, and how it could be achieved, I would like to start with some general wrap-up on the data necessary on the one hand for the message exchange itself, but also on the other hand with regard to the reference offer, so the service, the exchange of data, the services need to exchange between to accept that reference offer, and also so about having done that as a seamless experience. And so to start with, as we already heard, I think from a technical point of view, there are a lot of possible solutions already there, and I think all need to somehow exchange the data necessary for user identification, so for user discovery, and also with regard to encryption, there needs some information exchange on the data to allow end-to-end encryption for the message transfer. Also service discovery and service negotiation, like we heard before, on if there are some updates necessary and not all functions are implemented, and that includes also the metadata, which is going to be exchanged between two different services, and that leads to if we exchange metadata and the message data, then that also leads to the question of storage and handling of that data, and to include that to get to the seamless experience, like it's already discussed how it could be implemented in practical, to allow for the users to not mess up interoperability just by getting all the like cookie banner like opt-ins and so that to prevent user frustration just because the message flood gets too high. So that's I think an important point for the user satisfaction, and to take up of interoperability to encourage the contestability, one of the goals of the DMA. And one of the solutions, or one of the main challenges, I think, besides the technical ones, which seem somehow solved, are the data exchanged by two service providers to start getting interoperable with each other, and that means I would say that the reference offer should be as clear as possible with regard to all that data exchanges, all that opt-in that are necessary, all the data security roles, all the access control, like we heard a lot of what data is exchanged between two messaging services when exchanging messages, but there's also the need set up such interoperability between those messengers. So for the services itself, and there also need some data exchange, and that mean to prevent misuse of the interoperability interfaces. I would say the gatekeeper has some interest to not provide a general open like API or so, but to implement some form of access control for message reporting, etc., and maybe also turning misbehaving services off, and that also in the reference offer, besides the data protection rules, opt-in discussions, data security rules, access controls, there also need some update and then notice procedures and service level guarantees, and also the discussion about dispute resolution and how to handle that. As in the first panel already discussed, we at BEREC had the written report and included a lot of aspects what could be included in the reference offer, and I think that sums it up. I don't want to go in detail in every aspect we already included in the draft report, there are I think some more or less organizational questions open with regard to implement interoperability with view to the reference offer.
Thanks, Marcus. I think also yet another presentation makes clear how the user experience will be central in this discussion, what the users see at the end. Let's see now move to our last speaker, which is Ron, and bring us your experience from Wire.
Sure. Okay. So first of all, I apologize for my voice. Didn't have a voice at all yesterday, so please bear with me. So I'm Rowan May from Wire. One of the first things I wanted to mention is that we see a lot of our problems that we've had with implementing federation related to trust are similar problems to the ones that we see with interoperability. So we have a sort of a partial trust situation in both cases. And we've talked obviously about the reason we're here is to talk about the DMA, and the DMA is focused largely on consumer services, but the same solutions that we come up with, if we hope to use bits of standards solutions here and there, these are also going to be applicable in enterprise to enterprise or business to business scenarios. So anyway. Wire. Wire is the most important secure messenger that you've never heard of. But most of what I'm going to talk about today is about standards-based interoperability. Next slide, please. So you already heard Alyssa talk about MIMI. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the characteristics of MIMI and how they relate to the user experience. So the first is that MIMI is envisioned as a set of practical, minimal but extensible protocols that enable end-to-end encryption, interoperable messaging. We're not trying to standardize everything in MIMI. And there are a list of 6 specific areas that we want to talk about. These are the areas: identifiers, user introduction, message content format, MLS, profile, server-to-server transport, and identity are the areas that are in scope for the MIMI working group. Now, not surprisingly, some of these topics have come up over and over again in previous discussions. So I'm going to drill down on a few details about some of these here. One thing I was surprised about is we talked about identifiers only very briefly, and I believe Edgar talked about phone numbers as identifiers. Now, I I think a much more interesting question is, this is an identifier about what? Are we talking about a user's handle? Are we talking about an identifier for a room? Are we talking about someone's client? So many messengers, including WhatsApp, have support for multiple simultaneous clients. And so, and this is the norm in the enterprise space. So I have a WhatsApp web client and I have a WhatsApp client on my phone with the same user. And on Wire, I have, I don't know, 7 or 8 of them. But it's very common to have 2 or 3 clients per user. So it's very important that we're clear on which one or ones we're talking about at any given time. So that's one area that we want to have a clear framework where people can use that and say, I'm talking about this. And that we can disambiguate when we're talking about the same, maybe somebody has the same handle name or phone number looking thing in 2 different systems, that those still look like 2 different things to the computers involved. Regarding user introduction and discovery, how you safely start a chat with someone, this has been brought up over and over again. And what Mimi would like to do is, again, it's just to codify and make clear what are the existing best practices. These are things that many platforms are already doing very well. So let's tell people to keep doing that. It's not about making something super fancy and complicated. It's about conveying the information that already works. Regarding messaging content. So if we are using encryption, end-to-end encryption, once I've end-to-end encrypted something, I cannot change it through a gateway. So having some common format that I can use to convey messages is essential. Now, that doesn't mean that needs to be the only format that I use. And so here I want to speak again to the ability of individual companies, whether they're gatekeepers or other providers, to innovate. So I would be delighted if everybody supports a common messaging content format. And I'm perfectly okay with them supporting another, 1 to n other protocols of their own proprietary nature, as long as they also support the proprietary format and having a way to signal, these are the ones I support. So you could send a message that was end-to-end encrypted that contained a proprietary WhatsApp format or a proprietary Wire format, and also contains a standard content format. And so when it arrives in a group chat context on a device that doesn't support your proprietary format, it uses the standards-based one. What could be included there? Well, Mimi talks about, this has not been thoroughly discussed, but what is discussed in the initial set of documents is that message content that is substantially available on most messaging platforms. So not every messaging system has replies. Not every messaging system has emojis, but most of them do. And so supporting plain and rich text messages, supporting replies, mentions, those are all pretty standard features. There's not really any mystery on how those work. There are a variety of other message types which are not, which Mimi doesn't need to standardize. But this format should also be extensible so that if those do become standard features in the future, we can add them. We also had quite a bit of discussion about end-to-end encryption. So Mimi chose to use MLS as the protocol that it defines for message interoperability. and to specifically define a profile of MLS to make sure that end-to-end encryption works in an interoperable way. Now, I'm just going to rattle off a few reasons why we didn't use something else. So the first reason is change control. So the only other reasonable existing alternative would be to use the double ratchet protocol that was defined by Signal. And at the moment, it does not have change control outside of a single company. The second is extensibility. That also includes cipher suite agility, so the ability to do post-quantum, sorry, let's just say post-quantum crypto, but crypto which is resistant to quantum attacks. And finally, MLS also has the ability to have a tighter linkage to identity verification mechanisms. So I'm going to talk about end-to-end identity. That's not a mandatory feature of MLS, but it is something which is built into the protocol and can be used. So that's really a nice feature to have. So last two of these topics, we've got server-to-server transport mechanism. This is just how do you have two different services talk to each other over what protocol? So they would exchange messages. This could be an existing protocol. For example, XMPP or Matrix or whatever, right? And so we're going to define the requirements in MIMI, and then we're going to have a discussion about how do we do this, whether we use an existing protocol or build a new one, specifically by comparing that protocol against the requirements. Finally on this list, end-to-end identity, what does that mean? So if I have end-to-end encryption, that's great, but how do I know that I'm actually encrypting to Alan Durick instead of encrypting to someone else who is impersonating Alan Durick? So I could go and look at a fingerprint or a barcode or a QR code or something like that. But this end-to-end identity set of mechanisms, it provides ways where in a particular domain, you could say this is an authority which can assert that this particular private key for Alan, it is associated with somebody that I know of as Alan Durick who works at Wire. That's an extremely useful feature. When we talk about the trust, as I started earlier talking about, we have the trust that you are familiar with now when you use an encrypted website. So I can see the little padlock icon that tells me when I go to some website. Say I go to CNN.com. I can verify that was indeed the website, that CNN.com is associated with the address of my certificate, and that it was signed by some authority that was already in my computer. I can also make an independent judgment if I'm looking for if I do a search and I'm looking for information about the Zika virus. I'm much more likely to believe the Amsterdam Center for Tropical Medicine than I am Gloop.com, which has recently sold bottles of harmonized water for 20 or 30 euros each. The third thing is when I'm talking to potentially multiple parties that are in different services or different domains, is the domain of that person, does it make sense in that context? All right. So one of the things about end-to-end identity and a consistent set of identifiers is they provide a strong foundation for some of the features that are not mentioned in MIMI. So spam protection, abuse protection, these are things which benefit tremendously from having these mechanisms. Metadata protection can be greatly enhanced by us adopting an MLS profile which has those features. MIMI doesn't attempt to standardize a client-to-server protocol, and the bits that come out of MIMI, they can be implemented bit by bit. And so, for example, next year is very close. We're not likely to have a full suite of standards, but maybe if we have an introduction protocol, someone could go and implement an introduction protocol that allows for not just one directional but bidirectional ability to exchange information about someone being blocked. When group messaging becomes available, that's an excellent time to be able to use the MLS profile and a common messaging format. And then later, other pieces can be added and can be adopted. So I talked a lot about what MIMI is attempting to do here. But aside from this also being useful for enterprise-to-enterprise communication, why is this beneficial in the context of the DMA? So I think that this is good for the folks that are, operators that are seeking to interoperate with gatekeepers, because they only would need to implement one standard protocol to interoperate with multiple gatekeepers. And this would also drive the ability for us to have robust open source implementations. I think that it most importantly is good for gatekeepers. So maybe this isn't interesting to any of the gatekeepers now, but once a gatekeeper needs to have to offer connections to anybody else, a gatekeeper 1 could go and request access to gatekeeper 2's network. And that's a lot easier if gatekeeper 1 only needs to implement one standard protocol to talk both to operators requesting access to them and also to the other gatekeeper. In addition, even if 2 gatekeepers agreed that they wanted to interoperate, a standard protocol is going to be more neutral. And this type of protocol could also facilitate internal interoperability. For example, at Meta, if Meta wanted to interoperate between WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and Instagram, that is another particularly suited use. Now, how is this good for end users? Obviously, we've talked about the network effect, increasing the number of users with whom an end user can communicate. But I'm going to talk about a specific case with a non-gatekeeper operator with a user, Alice. Alice goes and creates a group chat. So we're now in 2-3 years from now. Alice adds Bob from gatekeeper 1, Kathy from gatekeeper 2. Both gatekeeper 1 and gatekeeper 2 have end-to-end encryption in their own networks. So Alice could send a message to both Bob and Kathy that's end-to-end encrypted from Alice. Now, what happens if Bob sends a message in that group chat? Is it end-to-end encrypted to Kathy? Gatekeeper 1 has to support the same protocol as gatekeeper 2 in order for Bob to be able to send that message. Now, I think that the user experience that we want is that we want that to work. We want there to be end-to-end encryption when someone from gatekeeper 1 sends a message in a group chat that involves another gatekeeper. Finally, I think this is good for competition because users, developers are going to spend a lot more time implementing new features instead of reinventing old ones. And it's good for the people who have to enforce this because a standardized protocol makes it easy to verify technical compliance because you can look at standard, and you can also run a standard test suite. One test suite, not 4 or 3. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rowan. I think we have unpacked the various issues even more. So that's giving us a lot of food for thought to the gatekeepers, potential gatekeepers too, and potential access seekers. I'm looking forward, I think, as we all are, to hearing now from the audience their comments, questions, and possible new ideas that have been inspired by the presentation. Yes, please.
Natasha Gerlach at Zippel. Just while you were talking, and Luca mentioned that earlier on, also on user identification, how in this interoperability framework, or where, do questions such as age verification or age assurance sit? I'm thinking of, there are certain platforms, there are restrictions on when users can access or what they can access, but if we create this interoperability between certain messengers, how do I make sure that somebody from the outside isn't coming into a chat group between 8-year-olds and starts to groom some of them, for instance, and this may be very naive here, and you may tell me this comes later down the line, but this is what came up, and I know the CNIL is working on tokenization technology right now to have this ready, but where does it sit and who monitors this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it really depends on the implementation, I think. It's really the discussion in one of my slides, whether you are actually bridging identities or whether you are actually bridging discussions. And if you are bridging identities, it means you have to have an account on each of the platform. So in this case, the age verification is handled by each platform on their domain, basically. It's their control, and they can ensure whenever you bridge the identities, they can apply the filters accordingly. On the other side, if you bridge on a discussion level, it's the same mechanism as inviting a third-party user with a one-time link, which is a mechanism which exists at the moment on some platforms, but not all. And in this case, you have to derive extra bits of protocol and verification to actually handle the age verification and such things at this step. So it's really a matter of implementation, I think. And there are many, interoperability is a wide principle, and now we are facing the question of how to implement it effectively and to balance between user experience, moderation, and fighting abuse, and having something freed for everyone. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up that there is also a technical solution using end-to-end identity, but it is more some time away, which would be using an end-to-end identity mechanism with verifiable credentials and verifiable presentations. This allows you to, in a standardized way, to convey attributes of the user without necessarily, with or without the user's actual identity. So you could convey that the user was over a particular age without revealing their date of birth, and optionally without revealing their actual name or identity.
Thank you. Any other question from the audience before we go and check online? Let's check online first then.
So we had a lot of question about identity. How can identity be maintained separately from network, so that switching between networks maintains identities? And another question, many services require existing identity to create accounts, such as phone number or email address. How will differing policies of services be respected?
Ron.
One thing that could be done, for example, with end-to-end identity is to have it linked to an identity provider for an operator that is seeking to gateway. So not every system would necessarily have their own needs to have their own identity service. In the case of some, for example, I could use, if I were Estonian, I could use my digital ID in Estonia, and I could use that to assert my identity. I could use them as an identity provider, and then I could prove my identity in that way. I could use, for example, my a Google account and to show that I have a particular, that I'm the owner of a particular email address. And of course, in addition, I could just have a plain assertion that this is a user known by this particular identifier handle, for example, or a room name on a particular system that is trying to gateway.
I think on the portability question, in my previous life I worked on a lot of regulations in the UK context around phone number portability and provider-led porting, and I think at that stage, there was a large involvement of like third parties to basically have a database that would enable, provider-led porting to work seamlessly. I think certainly from my perspective, that's quite beyond the scope of the DMA as it is today. It's obviously an interesting concept and maybe something that is looked at down the line, but it creates a whole other suite of potential privacy issues, which I think probably got enough on our plates. In terms of sort of phone number versus email identity versus others, obviously as I think the question says, each provider or a lot of providers have different approaches to this. When certainly in the WhatsApp team when we were thinking about this initially, there was certainly an initial thought about, well, can we coalesce around something that is, uniform across? There's certain benefits to that, and I appreciate people have different views around phone number as an identifier and certain properties of that. But one property is that it's quite well known. It's quite solid. It has some sort of verification almost built into it. The idea that you have to have a SIM card and a phone number identity. So there was certain attractions to that as some sort of almost in itself some threshold. But I appreciate that isn't how all third-party messaging services work. So there's very much, a sense that there will be multiple identities and that it'll be, a namespace of, identifier at a particular, so, your phone number at Signal might be different. Your account, with a phone number at a Signal might be the same phone number that you then use for WhatsApp, but will be identified differently, presumably, depending on which service you're using.
Yeah, thank you. With regard to the last question, I would say that the privacy topic needs to be solved by the opt-in. So the DMA clearly states that GDPR must be taken into account, which, I'm not sure if the opt-out would be possible here. So I would guess the privacy topic need to be an opt-in, and that's also what WIC in its study conducted.
See, the topic of identity matching is another tricky one. That's clear from the contribution. Anybody in the room would like to contribute, please?
That's a bit of a technical question, but since Stephen brought it up, I wanted to ask it anyway. You mentioned about having identifiers at a certain location, and knowing that WhatsApp was originally based on XMPP, I was kind of curious if you retained that concept internally, or do you have different identifiers that happen to be proven by a phone number, or is the phone number itself the primary identity?
Made the mistake of asking a simple or technical question. I can't answer specifically for this context, but I know from what the team is thinking about from third parties interoperating with WhatsApp, that's the kind of frame they have in mind is identifier at, the provider. That would be, I don't know if that is the current system that works within the first party network, but that's the thinking for identifying third parties, certainly.
Maybe another online question. Still on identity, some systems like Telegram have on purpose a pseudonymous ID. How would that combine with systems using phone number or email address as ID? Identifier.
So, any idea how to solve it? Yeah.
So, well, part of the question is actually whether the small platform should adapt to the gatekeeper, or whether the gatekeeper should adapt to the standard or to the small platforms. But one good thing with text messagings, and especially the ones which are running on smartphones, is that most of them are actually using numbers, phone numbers as identifiers. So you don't, well, you have a limited requirements for discoverability because you already have your address book on the phone. And this local address book can serve for matching between different messaging apps. So that might be easier in this setting than in a broader scope, thinking of just general messaging service on the web.
I just wanted to mention that technically, if you're trying to represent this inside of the system, or among different systems, we have a thing already called a URI that can contain a bunch of different variations of identifiers. We can represent a telephone number. We can represent something that looks like an email address, something that looks like a telephone number with an @ sign and a domain in it, and any other variation that you care to come up with. So technically, there's an easy way to make, if we use a standard introduction protocol, and if we treat the identifiers as opaque, meaning we don't change them when we pass them along in the system, then it's actually really easy to not care what the internal structure is of somebody else's system.
Yes, I wanted to talk a bit about the phone number because it was a convenient identifier to bootstrap WhatsApp because it was basically at the time the first one to use the phone number. But in a world of interop, it's a pretty bad identifier because you have one and can be on multiple services. So it doesn't say if with your phone number you cannot infer on which service my account is registered. So I can be on WhatsApp, or I can be on Telegram, or I can be anywhere else. So I think you have to have in the identifier, you have to have the name, the reference of the service. It's part of the identifier itself, and that's what is used in XMPP, for example, for federation or in matrix. You need to have a kind of reference to match the user.
I don't propose that we get the pros and cons of the as I say, the 2 billion daily active users that currently use phone number as an identifier. But I think to your point, I think we do have to resolve that question of how, multiple identifiers across different services, or the same identifier across multiple services, whether that creates some sort of, either just routing issues or just other identification problems. As I say, currently the team is trying to think about this in terms of the identifier at the particular service. So I'm hoping that minimizes it. But yeah, welcome thoughts on whether that alone will not be sufficient to mitigate these problems.
Just a second, I'm told that in the blind spot I had before, there was a question.
Yeah, so far we haven't been talking about authentication very much, and one of the aspects, I think Eric in the last panel was also saying, that ideally we do not only maintain the level of security, but also probably we increase it, and one aspect would be something like key transparency or something that makes sure that identifiers and the key material are linked together and that they can't be changed by anybody, including the providers. And the question would be particularly to the MIMI, but also probably to others, if that would be something you've been thinking about. Probably also to Meta. Thank you.
Rowan, you want to start? No.
It's not anything that's required right now in MIMI, and if you want to propose that a way to do it in MIMI specifically, that's great. But yeah, I mean, improved security is good. That's why the protocol is supposed to be extensible.
Not a huge amount to add. Authentication and verification, clearly issues that we're trying to grapple with and make sure that works. I think we've discussed many of the topics today that need to be covered under the DMA as it is. I think there is a risk that perfect becomes the enemy of the good if we try and, use the DMA as a vehicle to solve the ills of the, or so-called ills of the last, how many years. So certainly from our perspective, we're very much, alive to the challenges of things like user verification. But whether we, have to use that to try and create a perfect system, I think we'll struggle.
Adam, your turn, and then we go online again.
So, with something that may be quite controversial. It's not going to be about Meta this time. When we look a bit into the past with the GDPR, what made it successful was really more stick than a carrot. Do we have a right stick now for the cases that may be coming, like if someone is harvesting even more metadata, not Meta, someone else. Or when someone is, for instance, obstructing quality of service, because good thing is pretty much everyone's using WebRTC. So calls, if they go from operator A to service provider B, theoretically should be very comparable if they are within the same domain. And in the past, we've seen some of the cases where access providers were sabotaging access. So in this case also performance of the gatekeepers may be by accident suboptimal, giving a hint to users to stay within the island.
So is your question about That's a very good question. I'm eager to hear all the answers.
Yeah, maybe I begin taking up on that. So that's at least something we propose to include in the reference offer to in the BEREC draft report. We already have it, and yeah, as said before, the comments on that support us in including that in the reference offer. So at least some dispute resolution. Also, as I said in the beginning, some form of access control even for the gatekeeper. So that is solved, and but not also dispute resolution, but also discussions about liability and causes of terminating the agreements, and so you maybe also need a single point of contact, and so service level agreements. Those are aspects which we think need to be considered in the reference offer.
Just on the stick analogy, I think that there's quite a few big sticks in the DMA already, and ones that I think have caused a lot of people to potentially sit up and take notice. I think one aspect that may be missing, and Chiara I think touched on it this morning as well, is that no one wants to get there, right? Clearly, potential gatekeepers don't, and third parties don't, because then the system has failed. Whether there's some scope for a middle ground between some forum, some way of discussing issues as they arise in a less formal context. That may be something to consider. I worked previous life for my sins in telecoms, and after many decades of standardization of clear decision making, there's always tensions there, and they can be resolved in a number of ways. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that this will be easy or smooth. But the more mechanisms there can be to try and resolve these points, I think that's going to only be for the good, and avoid using the sticks, hopefully.
Any other comments from the panelists? We go to the next question. Camille?
Yes, so some question linked to contact list of users. How can interoperability be designed to stop leaking contact lists between communication providers? And the second question, when you use WhatsApp, you must consent to uploading your contact list, will interoperability discovery function without sharing contacts?
Again, on data minimization, maybe, if I can use a GDPR term. I'm sure.
I just wanted to talk technically about an introduction protocol does not take a position on sharing contact lists, and by default it would not. It would just be if you have a known identifier, is there something, if I request to connect to a specific user or search for a specific user by a specific identifier, do I come up with a response? And then can I connect to them? So in that way, I think that does not make the problem worse. And there are a variety of ways to make it better.
Yeah, so it depends. If you have already an account on the gatekeeper and you just bridge them, then your social graph is already within the gatekeeper, so you do not leak any extra bits of information. Otherwise, it depends also on the identifier, so it might not be the same whether you have a central local address book, such as with phone numbers, or whether you are relying on specific identifiers from the various platforms. Yeah.
Just briefly, I think the DMA is pretty clear on this in terms of obviously data minimization and bringing, calling in GDPR and e-privacy principles. Just on, leaking contact lists and consent uploading lists, I think again the feels to us at least outside the scope of at least the immediate DMA provisions. But I think, as I say, the obligation around data minimization seems pretty clear to us.
Yeah, thank you. I could also speak to that. So, Rafael Robert with Phoenix R&D. We are also involved in the MIMI working group and working specifically on that question of metadata also. So first of all, zooming out a bit, this is a relatively new field. So in the past years, we've been focusing on confidentiality and security, and privacy is very important, but we are only now looking at it more than we used to. And so I think we are bound to see a lot of interesting research in that area. Paul Ressler earlier hinted at some stuff there. This is also what we are working on very specifically to completely minimize the kind of metadata of who is talking to whom, which is essentially the address book in other words. But it could be even more specific, so not only the address book, but quite literally, especially in group communication, who's part of the group, who is sending messages at what frequency, etc. So we can, at this point on a technical level, what we can already achieve today is that we can boil that down to the actual identifiers as such, but not in what scenarios they communicate with each other. So this is definitely going to be a very interesting area of research and development in the coming years.
Who volunteers for reactions? No. I see rather acknowledgements of your point than reactions. I think you had another one. No?
Yes, I had a comment on the question of the address book. So yes, Michael Raymond again. The address book, sharing the address book is to trigger some kind of virality, and it's needed in a world where you need to open an account on each platform, and you start with on a new platform and you have no contact, and you need to populate your contact list. In a world that is interoperable and federated, you have less need, in my feeling, to share the address book itself, because you will build up your contact list and your social graph, and it can be ported, and you keep it with you thanks to interoperability. So I think the problem could be solved in a way by the fact that it's not needed anymore to share the contact address book.
An interesting remark indeed. I'm seeing online that there is a question on consent fatigue related to the user experience. So I'm curious myself to hear the panelists. How do we minimize this risk?
Yeah, exactly. So that's also a big fear I have to, as I said in the beginning, to take care that not the same Pavlov stock clicking like for cookie banners arises here. So as I understand the WIC study, it's the first thing is the opt-in could be per service, so there's no need to opt in per communication, but it would be enough to opt in per service for every user, so that I think could minimize the flood of that menu dialogues, at least in the beginning.
And additionally, and this is also a comment regarding the question of quality of service. So this is something which is part of the implementation and of the reference offer, which can be reviewed. And then these are also things which can be monitored. So for quality of service, technically we can review it periodically or monitor it across variety of services and configurations, and check whether there are deviations from what should be the standard, at least according to the reference offer. And same thing for actually consent fatigue. And this is something which is often told about cookies content and cookies banner. And this is something that you can, there are a lot of academic studies, and at PEReN we are working on this field as well, as checking how are displayed the cookie consent banners and trying to build automated heuristics to look at contrast, to look at size, at fonts, and to have an heuristic for whether the cookie banner is within standards or something very different from usual ones.
I think, as Luca said, consent fatigue, and that topic is not a new one. It's certainly not, I would say, specific to messaging. From the interoperability perspective, we have, again, that trade-off of, users shall remain free to decide whether to use the interoperability provisions, and also being, provided with sufficient information. So there is clearly, again, a tension. From our perspective, I think agree largely with Marx's comments and on those of the WIC study that, an opt-in model per service probably makes sense. I think, anything more granular than that starts to get quite siloed. So that's certainly current thinking, but yeah, that's.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess on this topic of opt-in per service, I think it kind of depends on what model you think you have of the world. I mean, if your model is telephony, that would be a very weird construct. Like, do you want to talk to people on T-Mobile? You're on British Telecom. That's just not the way people think about the problem. And so if you think of it, I guess if you think of this as like, interop is the exceptional case, then that makes sense. But if you think of this as interop as the base case, and what you really want is to promote interoperability, then I think the consequence of having opt-in is going to be like an enormous amount of opt-out and a lot of not interop. And also I think will require an enormous amount of policing by the regulators to ensure that the gatekeepers do not incent users to opt out rather than encourage them to opt in. So I think it's important to think about what we're trying to accomplish here.
Just on the telephony, I guess, comparison or otherwise, I think obviously there's I think quite a different paradigm potentially in messaging. WIC and others, I think, have pointed to the different uses people put messaging services to. Obviously, you might have, particular choice for your friends and family, another choice for business context, and so on. So I think people do, maybe that's, the world we're in. I don't know, maybe it'll change over time, but certainly as things are today, I think people have quite different attitudes to different messaging services. It's not sort of as vanilla, I think, as a T-Mobile versus a Verizon versus an Orange. Maybe that'll come over time. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's a good thing if it would, but I think the need for the opt-in per service precisely comes from the differences people attribute to different services, but also, frankly, the different policies that apply. Right? It's not as standardized across in terms of functionality and privacy use cases, all those other aspects that we've talked about, security as well. So I think that need for the more granular level of opt-in consent comes precisely from those differences between messaging and telephony.
We have two more panelists who want to intervene, please.
Just with a comparison with the telephony, the business models is probably very more diverse for messaging than for telephony. For telephony, basically everyone pays monthly bills, and the other end pays for his telephony service. For messaging, basically it's everything is free and it's mostly data driven. So just from a GDPR perspective, you must consent for the handling of your personal data when you end up on the other service. If you imagine a gatekeeper which is not end-to-end encrypted and using a lot the data for his business model.
I think we have to be a bit careful when we talk about a service in the context of some enterprises. I think are going to want to interoperate, and so there would be a difference between a Microsoft Teams user as Maersk Shipping from fantastic timeshares Mallorca.com.
I think I have a number of people I have forgotten, like Vittorio, I have Jan, I have, sorry, your name I forgot, and then even another one down there. So Vittorio.
I'm Vittorio Bertola, Open Exchange. So again, I think that the identity discovery authentication part is the key, maybe the one where we need to do more work. And I'm not too worried about the identification discovery, because I think in the end it will work like it works today. So someone will give you an identifier, which could be a telephone number or something different, but a string of characters, and you will put it into your client, and then you will be able to start the procedure. But the problem is then when you start. So I think, first of all, that we have to be flexible. So there will be users that want to authorize in advance each new user that wants to communicate with them. There will be others that would just accept whatever comes and maybe ban the ones that they don't like after a while. So I think the important thing is that we build a flexible mechanism and protocol rather than forcing one model onto everyone. But what I was wondering is that I mean, there are a number of cases in which you want to do anonymous, pseudonymous communication, and they should be protected. But in most cases, you really want to be sure the identity of the other person. So should we think at some kind of integration with the eIDAS, or more generally with the various verifiable credentials and the formats of attestations that are coming up, so that optionally, when I start chatting with you for the first time, I can provide you some third-party attestation of my proper identity, so that you can accept the communication with more trust, maybe.
Can I just add to this with my commission hat that the eIDAS will be completely voluntary for the users to use. So just to be absolutely clear. Okay. Okay. So anybody wants to react? No? Then we go to Jan.
Thank you. And I don't want to ride too much on the topic that we already discussed, but I think the whole discussion about consent feels overblown to me. I mean, now all in a sudden, we've accepted these cookie banners for years because we were worried taking away profits from the tracking ads industry. And now all in a sudden we discover that consent is a problem. No, and we already today, if you open Signal or Element and there's a new person who wants to chat with you or call you, you'll have to agree to that before they can do that. That's totally already there. We'll just have to add another piece of information, which is which service are they using at the moment. And that's that. And there's no fatigue attached to that at all, in my opinion. It's tiny as compared to what people have to put up with on websites at the moment, just for the tracking ads industry.
Just a comment on this. It's very different from one-to-one messaging and group messaging, because when you are one-to-one messaging, you have to approve. When you are within a group, you might have approved when you join the group initially, but then you have to be carefully monitoring which user might be added. For instance, I might be okay to share my data and to share a group with people on platform A, but probably I don't want people from gatekeeper B. So I have to monitor the group, and whenever someone is added, I have to check whether it's still okay from my perspective or not. So it's a bit different from one-to-one messaging and group messaging, I think.
You wanted to ask a question?
Well, yeah, so much has come by now that that I only want to respond now to the last thing. So if that was going to be a problem, you could have a group configure which services it will allow contact with. I don't really think that that it is that much of a problem technically to resolve.
I don't think you meant it technically. You meant it to have it on the radar, right? So that's okay. First, gentleman.
Hi, Kay Jabeli, CCIA. We've been talking about the possible implementation of an industry-wide protocol like MIMI or Matrix and others, but are all the ones we're talking about free to license and use the technology, or like how do they pay for their development, or are we sort of introducing a new cost that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, thank you. So I will start and just refer to the DMA. It says free of charge. That's the beginning, I would say, and also maybe some the question of IPRs already raised a couple of times. If we so it depends on the solution at the end. If it comes to like libraries or APIs, so IPRs needs to be discussed. But I'm not a lawyer, but the DMA says free of charge. I'm not sure how that fits together.
For Mimi, the intent is to develop something that has no royalties, is completely patent-free. There is an IPR process at ITF, so somebody could come along and say, hey, I invented this, but given that so much of this is stuff that we've already been doing for 20, 25 years, that seems very unlikely. And XMBP, I know, has nothing, and I believe Matrix is nothing, yeah.
Related, there is a question of codecs as well, and especially in the future, situation might be different. But if a platform is using a revolutionary codec, which is proprietary, how should it be licensed to third parties for interoperability? And in particular, would the gatekeeper platform be forced to release quite open source, like free of charge at least, this codec to everyone to allow for interoperability, or would it be limited to just a subset of interoperable features?
Afraid I don't have a perfect answer to that one, but I can only acknowledge what the DMA itself says, which is obviously that whatever the gatekeeper provides needs to be provided free of charge. Whether there's third-party implications, that's kind of beyond the immediate scope, but yeah, certainly from the gatekeeper side.
We have Alisa first, or it was about the previous?
It was, yeah. I think we covered the license fee issue. Just coming back to this notion of consenting to each additional individual added to a group. I mean, maybe this is what you were saying as well, Ralph, but I don't really understand the mental model behind that, because it seems to me that even in the DMA text itself, it's already established that the gatekeeper doesn't have to interop with another service that can't either meet its level of security or that endangers the integrity protections that it has in place for the service. And so I feel like that will already resolve a priori the concern on that you would move that choice down to the user level, and on a group by group basis, or on a user joining a group by group basis, have to force this decision. That seems like actually the worst possible outcome. And I do think the way that it's set up in the DMA does put a lot of focus and attention on any decisions that a gatekeeper would potentially make about refusing to interoperate with a particular service. I think the idea that you raised earlier, Stephen, of having some threshold, some abuse threshold, and then potentially choosing to revoke interop or deny it on the basis of an abuse threshold is a very interesting concept, and assume that there's a lot of prior art there from email and the this notion of reputation services that would have to get developed a little bit more in the messaging space in order to make that viable. But I think it is viable. But that to me is like a much more feasible way of meeting this need and much better from the user perspective than trying to bump this choice down to make it 1,000 choices for 1,000 users that join a group. That doesn't seem workable to me at all.
Luca, you want to react? It was your comment that triggered passion.
Yeah. So it's there was the idea of giving consent by platform. In this case, the problem is solved because whenever you encounter a new platform, you just consent or not, and that's all. And then you are, you can handle everything from there. But if you are handling consent discussion by discussion, I don't see really how you handle. Well, if you imagine you have a group, let's say you have a group with some users from you're on a given platform and you have another platform, and this is fine. You just created the group with these persons and you consented. Then you had an extra user from a different platform. Then what would be the UX and the user experience when you add this user? So the admin of the group would add the user. He obviously consents to everything, but then how would the other ones in the group react? I mean, is the invitation pending till everyone gives his agreement or not?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that the idea that you have this matrix of individual user choices about whether any other individual can join the group based on which service they're using is completely unworkable. Doesn't make any sense. So like maybe this consent to a service model works, but I actually think the real best way is that the services between themselves decide if they're going to interoperate or not, and that decision is predicated on the set of properties that are important to both services' user bases actually being met in the interoperable case. If you see what I'm saying, like actually. Fewer of these choices for the user because like the rising tide has lifted all boats, and that would be a benefit in this interoperable scenario. So we make the user make less choices because by virtue of having decided to interoperate, the services have agreed that they're providing the same set of guarantees that they were providing independently.
Okay, so then sorry. Then but it means that whenever two services want to interop, they have to basically adapt their terms of services to include the fact that they interop. Yeah, okay. So that's different. Well, yeah, this is another model, and we are. Well, that's the point. That Article 7 is drawing a vision, but then there is a question of how do you effectively implement it, and it can be at the service level, it can be at user level, and whether you consider interoperability a user right or actually a service right. But this is something which I think would work too.
Before going back to the room, I think the online audience has been waiting.
So from the online audience, a question that is more directed to Meta. Do you expect moving towards two different versions of each messenger, one for EU only, that is interoperable, and one global version not interoperable?
I'm not sure it's a question of versions necessarily, but it is a question of, I think it came up in some of the previous discussions around, well, who does the DMA apply to and in what circumstances, is it EU users or is it a global application? I guess from our perspective, certainly it's quite clear in the DMA that the services are ones that are provided in the EU. So that's, I think already a necessary gating function. But I think, by its nature, the DMA is focused, I think, as was mentioned previously, on EU users. So how that applies and how it looks and feel may be different, let's say, for an app in the EU versus outside the EU, but I don't think it'll necessarily lead to different, obviously different versions as such. It's just how the look and feel may be slightly different, which I think others probably may know, I think it may already have variance depending on jurisdictional rules in any event. So I don't think that'll be too novel.
Thanks, Steve. I think I had seen you wanted to intervene, or is the outdated by now?
Yeah, I mean, I think just generally, you know, regardless of these sort of questions about consent, we need to work through what the experience of the user is going to actually be in a bunch of these cases. And I think these group messaging cases are good examples of that, where some possibilities are like extraordinarily aversive. So like the one you suggested, I don't think you're seriously making it, where every user has to consent. Like, you know, users are offline, and so the idea the group can't form for like someone who's been offline for 2 weeks, like that obviously is unworkable. And so I think like what we have to do is like, you know, people are raising some important points about what like meaningful consent is, but I think we have to work through what the implications of all those things are to the user experience and see which ones will just cause like basically the system not to work entirely. And so that's going to take some thinking, I think.
I don't see reactions. I've seen raising hands over there.
Simon Phipps from OSI. This discussion about consent is quite concerning if you have a worldview where there are self-hosted messaging platforms, because it essentially means that every single user of a self-hosted or micro platform is going to have to be consented in a way that users of large platforms are not having to be consented in. I also very much support Vittorio's observations about the need for flexibility. I'm already using, so I have an account on Mastodon. I'm self-hosting my Mastodon server. I don't have to consent to messaging with anybody. I don't have to consent to viewing the messages from the people who I've chosen to follow or from the ones that they repost. And so far, that's going pretty well for me. And so that is also a messaging application. And it seems to me that assuming that one size that is based on your worldview, that this is about WhatsApp interoperating with Signal or some other similar personal messaging scenario, is going to be inadequate. You're going to need a lot of flexible options that fit the use case for the kind of messaging service that you're hosting, and allow for the possibility that a user is going to be self-hosting their platform and not using some major platform to engage in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree that I think we should get to a flexible solution. Maybe with regard to the example of Mastodon, I'm not sure if we could compare it to that, because Mastodon is already public, so there's no need for all the privacy discussions and so I'm not sure if it's a very good comparison, but yeah, now I forgot what I wanted to say initially. That's maybe I come back later.
You wanted to ask a question and I didn't give you the floor before.
It's more like getting a little bit scared. Lucas, don't get me wrong, but licensing codex, I think we concluded that story 20 years ago. There's a WebRTC, and if we want now to introduce again possibility for someone to start enforcing licensing, DMA is not going to be very successful, because it's going to stop a number of small players, and this is or I misunderstood you when you said.
No, that's not what I said. So there is a current situation, and there is what could develop. So you can imagine a platform having an advantage because they derive a new algorithm or new codec or whatever for compressing video calls, let's say. They might have this proprietary technology and not build it open source. And in this case, what would be the situation? DMA should be future-proof in this sense. So what would be the situation and what would be the licensing in this case, if you want to interrupt with it?
Yeah, so that one, as said, like now the answer is WebRTC, and whatever gets into the WebRTC is offered on the royalty-free basis. And I think also for the future, like if something is coming there, they should be making money, same as it was with my company 20 years ago. putting better acoustic echo cancelling and other stuff, and that's why Google bought it at the end, not trying to extract or extort the money on the basic codec. That one, I think we saw it 20 years ago, and we should go now further.
Yeah, I just mean this is a practice at the moment. There is no provision in the DMA for this. So, well, for usage of WebRTC or building on top of it. So, if someone decides to have an adversarial approach and not build on WebRTC and not follow the practice at the moment, how would it be handled by the DMA?
If anybody has the answer, I'm happy to hear. Marcus wanted to take
Yeah, exactly. Regarding the previous question, because that also came up this morning. With regard to the self-hosting services, I think that's a very good question, and maybe there's some solution like already presented when talking about bridges. It could be thinking out loud a solution to, let's say, Matrix provides a bridge, and everyone running a Matrix server could implement that bridge, and maybe the Matrix goes into the reference offer, and that could maybe solve the question of. Nevertheless, there are a lot of questions waiting after that, with access to the data for third parties that needs to be solved, which would be that the case then. But maybe this is something to think about. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcus. I think it's quite nice because your intervention made me think also the various contributions before that what will be in the reference offer will be quite crucial aspects in general, but also for how to interoperate with the smaller players, which was raised throughout the course of the day. So I, mindful of the time, I would wrap it up here. Thank you very much to all the panelists for their contributions, and to all of you for your questions and insightful comments, and give the floor back to Rita for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. So I will keep it short. It has been a very long and intense day, I think, for everybody. So first of all, of course, I want to thank you so much for all of you to be here and for your very active participation and in the very stimulating and informative event that we had today. So this has provided a unique opportunity for an open and constructive exchange on a very key topic of the DMA. So in this context, a very special thanks to all the panelists of this morning and the afternoon who helped to frame the discussion and ensure that it stayed relevant and informative. And also a special thanks to all of you in the room and online who raised a number of very relevant questions that allowed for a very good mapping of the issues that we heard today and that are relevant in the debate on interoperability. So I personally have heard excellent interventions and examples and the discussion. So also great thanks to the colleagues for organizing and managing to bring all of you together, which made it quite a unique event, I think. So it has very much helped today to disentangle the various matters. And of course I will not be able, and good for you also, that I will not be able to do proper justice to all the individual points, but you should be assured that we have made very good note. So maybe in this context still good to make a few general points that we find important. Also, as we will be moving forward to ensure compliance. So one thing that Simonetta signaled this morning in her opening remarks is the importance of early engagement with all parties for the success of ensuring effective implementation. Today was a first valuable step, but we would indeed want to continue the discussion with all of you, also in the context of the pre-designation discussions that we are having. We also have heard from speakers that we need to learn from past regulation experiences. So I heard repeatedly there's already a 20-year-old process going on, but also we can learn from other areas with respect to fintechs, for instance, or telecoms, where similar challenges have been addressed. So it was also noted this morning that we need to build a good learning process so that we get a chance to improve on what worked well and what may not have been perfect from the start. So this is a progressing process, and we may get it better or get it right going forward. And in this context, it was noted that we even need to take into account already the post-quantum era. Also noted in this context, I carefully wrote it down, the costs of getting it wrong are high, so to take into consideration. We also heard that we need to take into account, of course, the needs of users, who may not often fully understand their rights or the implications of their choice. This is a specific challenge that we will collectively have to take into account. So I heard very pertinent points today about user choices and treatment of user data and clarity around those issues that we will need to consider, all of us on the various sides of the tables, to consider as we are going along. Now, this afternoon, of course, was very much devoted to a series of key requirements and points that should be considered. So, and what I'm in particular happy about that we heard this afternoon is that while end-to-end encryption and security are key requirements, there are already standardization solutions out there that could contribute to the implementation of Article 7. Also, we have heard, and which is, I think, a very positive point of today, various speakers saying that we have an opportunity to build solutions that are even more protective, secure, and privacy-friendly. In that sense, also the discussion has been unique in the way that it was a collective process aiming at innovation in the interest of the general public, which is already triggered now by the DMA. So then on standardization, it was very interesting to hear the lively discussion about the role that standardization can and should play in the context of Article 7. So one thing in this context is clear, the solution should be agile and adaptive. So the Commission can, of course, also, if there's a need and if it's appropriate, move to standardization. It's tempting to do that early on, but of course also standardization requires engagement and buy-in by the various parties. So it should not allow operators to sit back. We should not forget that the DMA imposes obligations on individual gatekeepers and they need to deliver. There's also an ambitious timeline, which is in all situations necessary if you want delivery. So the ball will be in the court of the gatekeepers after the designation. Now, having said that, it's also clear from today that there's already a number of technical solutions, including ones that are being considered, that aim to ensure effective interoperability in a manner that will safeguard confidentiality and privacy of communication channels, and also will allow tackling of abusive behavior by allowing the reporting of such behavior or even blocking where this is justified. So it's important to bear in mind that these solutions are already available, and I personally enjoyed very much seeing that there was a demo on an example that already works. Very good result of today. There was also an interesting discussion on scale, on the need for scale, but also whether that may already be there. Now, the third panel, of course, highlighted the challenges about the management of identity and discoverability. And we have heard a lot about the importance of transparency, both between gatekeepers and third-party providers, but also towards end users to ensure that they can make informed choices. Finally, of course, also the centrality of user experience has been highlighted. Now, to me at least, and I think also to the colleagues, this has been a very valuable experience, and it very much confirms also the value of these workshops in general. We had a very good one on self-preferencing, and there will be soon one on app stores. So it's also clear that the commitment of everybody around the table today, so gatekeepers, third parties, academia, experts, will be crucial to make interoperability really a success. So, as I said, there will be further workshops, and I do hope that we can look forward to your continued engagement, having all your brains work towards something that will be an effective solution. Was already very useful today, and it will be indispensable going forward. So, thank you very much.